Hello everyone, my name is Solvashez and welcome to this FS 2020 video, and boy is it great to finally be able to say those words. We are here today in the main menu because we are doing a performance video. I know we've already done one of these before, but we noticed in the comments section that there was a lot of frustration how we used a high-end PC for the video. So today we're going to be using a more mid-range PC, that's my computer, and putting it through the paces and seeing what kind of performance we can get out of it. In this video, we are first going to go over my system specs, then we're going to look at the performance that you get at the main menu, because yes, that is a thing, and then we're going to look at the settings that I have everything set up to be for FS 2020, and then after that, we'll get in the air in a GA aircraft in a high density area, then a GA aircraft in a low density area, and then after that, we will also do the same in a jet to see if there's any difference there before wrapping up the video. So let's get on with today's video. To start things off, as I said, we're going to go through a spec list. So this is what my computer is, and you can compare it to your own to see if anything is similar. For my GPU, I have an Intel Core i5-8500 at 3 GHz. For memory, I have 32 gigabytes of memory. This is from Team Group, and I have 4 sticks of memory, so each one is 8 gigabytes. I'm running FS 2020 on a Toshiba HDWE150 hard drive because it took up enough space on my SSD that I wasn't able to put it on there since I have quite a bit on my SSD. For my GPU, I have a Nvidia GeForce GTX 1070. Not the 1070 Ti, just the regular 1070. So FS 2020 is running on this as we speak. So before we begin and we look at the main menu and then we look at my settings, I would like to say really quickly that you might experience an increase in performance since this is a pre-release copy of the flight simulator, so some things could be patched before release day on the 18th, and I am also running OBS in order to record certain features on here, so you might experience higher frames per second there since your computer does not need to record its screen. Here at the main menu, we're getting 60 FPS and around 80 to 75% GPU usage, and 45 to 50% CPU usage. And the reason that we're getting those types of numbers here is that if you go to profile and you go to your hangar, you'll notice that an aircraft is actually loaded in the background. This is the aircraft I've used most recently, the A320 Neo. So the GPU and CPU are being used to render this aircraft into the background of the menu system. As you can see, it is right here. It's hard to see, but you can see it through panels here. Despite the fact that the CPU and GPU are being used at the menu, it is still super snappy and responsive. Here I have no issues with that. Let's hop into our options here and I will show you what settings I have on here for the graphics. So we are displaying at full screen with a resolution of 1920 by 1080, and the global rendering quality, that is, it sets all of the advanced settings to a typical area, is for high end. The next one you can go to is Ultra, which I have not set it to because Ultra does give me stutters in high density areas specifically, but occasionally in low density areas as well, and in extreme cloud situations. I have switched it down to high end, and high end basically makes it so every single setting here is set to high and most settings are on, with a few being off here. If you would like to tinker with that, then you can just switch from high to ultra and it will just switch to a custom option here. But I think that the high end options suit me just fine, and it doesn't really subtract that much detail that was already in the simulator. So now that we've got that out of the way, we can go back to the home here, and we haven't changed anything, so we're just going to discard that, and we're going to begin our first flight. So we're going to begin in a GA aircraft, a prop aircraft, so we're going to go here to prop and go on over to the 172. because that is one that I am very familiar with, and we're going to begin in a high density area. So the best place that I can think of for that is Los Angeles International Airport, a very high density area, and we're going to be departing from 17 left, going straight on into the city and pointing at all of the traffic and buildings over there. So without further ado, let's fly. Alright, so here we are at Los Angeles International Airport in the Cessna 172 Skyhawk, and we are going to be departing into the LA basin and seeing what kind of performance we get. So right here in the loading area before we press ready to fly, we're getting about 85 to high 90% GPU usage, and then we're getting around mid 70s to high 80s CPU usage. And our RAM is staying about the same, and you can see throughout the loading sequence right here, a few things spiked at some points but then went down at others, and that is that. So now that we're all ready to get going, let's take off into the LA basin and see what kind of FPS we get. One thing I would like to note also as we continue the takeoff roll is that since I am running OBS, you should experience a higher frames per second. And also since I am trying to monitor my usage, you're also going to notice that my GPU and CPU is used quite a bit more than you might experience. So we're getting around a steady 30 FPS here in the takeoff roll, and it really does make no difference, honestly. It feels as if I am still flying rather smoothly, regardless of the frame loss. And I can't really tell a difference between what it was like when I was not trying to track all this stuff and I didn't have OBS running and now. So LA is a pretty highly densely populated area, so this is a pretty good frames per second here, considering all the things that I am running in the background as well, in order to show you guys what kind of performance I am getting. So let's continue on and we'll see what kind of frames we're getting. It seems as if as we have left the ground, our frame rate is actually going up, and now we're going to around 40 frames per second and sticking close to around that number, while the GPU and CPU usage is staying around the same, with the GPU occasionally actually going down to 50% like it did just there. So let's switch onto the outside view and see if we have any changes. In the outside view, it seems like we had a spike with the GPU and the CPU, but still really smooth, around 40 frames per second. And as you can see, there is a lot loaded here. So this is rather impressive considering the dense population, of Los Angeles. And I still think it looks really solid from here as well. And I have no complaints about the way that everything looks. So let's keep on flying. I'll be quiet for a moment and we can monitor some of the performance figures and see how everything continues to look. So it seems like the higher we get in altitude, the less frame loss that we're getting, and we're sticking at around a comfortable 45, and occasionally I saw 50 there frames per second. A really solid experience. I know that that doesn't seem like it's extremely high, especially considering the fact that most people like to run at around 60 frames per second, but you really cannot notice a difference between the two. Normally, when I am flying without recording anything, I actually get a solid 50 to 55 frames per second. But this is totally comfortable right now. I have no problems with controlling, and I'm able to control the aircraft without the lower frames impacting my flying ability. So really solid performance, especially considering that I am using OBS and other stuff to record. Now we're going to hop into the A320 and we're going to do some flying around here and see if flying in a jet and at higher speeds changes the performance in any way. So now we're starting at the same place that we started with the 172 at Los Angeles, but this time we're in the Airbus A320 Neo, and it seems like we're getting around the same frames per second right now in the exterior and the same CPU and GPU usage as well. When we hop into the interior, that is also shared there, where we're getting around mid-20s to high 20s in the frames per second realm, and also around 60% to 70% with the CPU. So it does go down a little bit. I will say, even though that FPS number does look like it is a little bit low, I am not having any trouble moving around and interacting with elements here. Everything seems to be really smooth for me, and I am not experiencing anything that would impede my ability to fly the plane while at this frames per second. So let's put those flaps down to 2, and we will head off out into the LA basin once more, see what kind of frames per second we get, see if it's similar to the 172, and we can draw a quick conclusion for what it is like in the larger populated areas. So let's get flying. On the takeoff roll, you can see that it is becoming a little bit stuttery, and that is making it a little bit more hard to fly. But this is not something that I experience when I am not recording using OBS or displaying my frame rate in the top left corner. So now that we're actually way past our rotate speed, we're going to rotate, throw the gear up, prevent ourselves from going over speed there. I have my thoughts on the A320, but we will not get into that in this video, and we'll continue on in LA Basin. Just like before, it seems like we lost quite a few FPS as we started the takeoff roll, but as we continued to go out into altitude, things seem to get quite a bit better. And honestly, I'm okay with that. Because you spend the majority of your time in the air, so having a little bit of a frame loss when you're on the ground is really not the biggest deal in the world. And although it made it a little bit hard to navigate when I was on the takeoff roll, it wasn't too bad. And also, as I said, I don't experience frame loss like this when I am not recording all of this stuff for YouTube. So now that we're up higher in altitude, the speed is definitely making a difference. We're getting a lower frames per second. In the 172, we were getting around 45 and almost 50 frames per second. And now that we're at about the same altitude and a little bit higher, we are getting around 30 frames per second and occasionally going up to 32 to 33 frames per second. CPU and GPU usage isn't extremely high though, which is surprising considering that we are having this frame loss. But it's also not a frame loss that is impeding my ability to fly. I am very comfortably able to bank left right here and then bank right here, and everything is running rather smoothly. Let's check out the outside view. And as expected, the frame loss decreases as we go into the exterior view, and the GPU and CPU usage does increase since it is trying to render more of the land than it would previously. But I think that LA still looks really good, even though I'm not at ultra settings here. And as I have said multiple times now, the frame loss is nothing that makes it so that I'm not able to fly the plane, and 60 frames per second is really not needed. As long as you can get a solid 30, then you'll have a great flying experience. So now we are going to hop on over to Pittsfield Municipal Airport, which is in Massachusetts, and we're going to do some flying in the A320 and Cessna 172 in a moderately populated area to see what kind of frames and performance we get over there before wrapping up this video. Welcome to Pittsfield Municipal Airport. We're getting around the same CPU usage here and a much higher frames per second. We're getting approximately 20 frames per second more than we were getting on the ground at Los Angeles, but our GPU usage is up quite a bit, and I bet that's probably because there's a lot more trees in the area, and Microsoft has made it so that the GPU handles a lot more of the rendering of the trees. You guys already know what's next. Let's take on off and head over to the Pittsfield area to see what kind of frames per second we get over there. As we continue our takeoff roll, it seems like everything is staying rather steady instead of decreasing like it was at Los Angeles. That's a good sign. And once we're off the ground, we're seeing the CPU climb a little bit, but not that much, and our frames per second is staying about the same. So now we're going to make a right turn towards the Pittsfield area, and we'll see what kind of frames we get. As we begin the turn and Microsoft Flight Simulator starts to load the area, it looks like we're getting a lower frames per second, and that makes sense since it is loading. But as I've said in Los Angeles, it doesn't really impede my ability to fly too much, so it's nothing too ridiculous. We should probably see it steady out as we fly towards the downtown area. So let's level out right here, and it seems like the frames per second has leveled out quite a bit, and the CPU is back to where it was along with the GPU. So everything is about the same as it was when we were on the ground as we head on towards the Pittsfield area. So a lot steadier frames per second in these areas, besides when it was loading, and I think that's partly due to the fact that there aren't as many objects to load. So your computer does not have to work as hard to get some results. But everything still looks really solid in my opinion. I have been to this area multiple times, and this is exactly what it looks like, so everything looks really nice. And still, even though we're not on ultra settings, we're still getting a really nice experience, and everything looks really great. So as to be expected, frames are a lot better over here, but they're also a lot more steady. Let's hop on into the jet and see if we get any difference in frames per second with that. Now we are at Pittsfield in the A320. Taking it off is going to be quite the feat, but we'll get to that in a few moments. It seems like we're having a lower GPU and CPU usage here, which is interesting. I think it has to do with the fact that the cockpit has a lot less visibility compared to the Cessna 172, so there's a lot less loading that has to go in order to show you what the world looks like. We do have a little bit of a frames per second drop. In the beginning, it was actually wavering close to around 35 frames per second when I first loaded it up, and now it's at the high 30s and low 40s, which is about a frames per second drop of 5, which isn't really too bad. That's not anything that's too noticeable. It still feels really smooth though. My experience is still not impeded, and when we go on out to the outside, it looks like we're getting around the same frames per second here, but the CPU and GPU usage has gone up quite a bit, and that probably has to do with the fact that a lot more is being loaded in order to show you the world around you. So Let's hop back into the cockpit and see if we can't get this bird off the ground here and fly over to Pittsfield and see what frames we get there. As we continue our takeoff roll, it seems like everything is staying about the same, which is exactly what we experienced in the 172. The frames per second has dropped down to being a lot more steadily lower, so it is still steady, but it is not as high. Looks like we just got her out of here, just in time for the runway to end, which is I don't know how realistic that is, but you know, we got her off the ground and that's all that counts. Let's begin our right turn over towards Pittsfield and we'll look at the performance over there. Right now we're not getting that frame drop as much, but that's probably due to the fact that we are also not looking at any of the scenery. So actually when we go down a little bit, the frames per second does drop a little bit, but nothing too crazy. We're getting around the same performance that we were getting in the 172. So pretty solid. Excuse me for going over speed there. I am paying attention to the top left corner of the screen quite a bit, so that is my mistake. But nothing too crazy, and it is still really flyable. We'll continue our right-hand turn to go towards Pittsfield to see if there is any difference, but as to be expected in these lower density areas, the frames per second loss is really not that major, and everything is really steady and makes for a great flying experience.
$2,500.
Albany approach Airbus Alpha Sierra X-ray 320 is type Airbus A320 5 miles northwest of Kilo Papa Sierra Foxtrot. Request flight following. Airbus Alpha Sierra X-ray 320 Albany approach squawk 0177.
So we are going towards downtown Pittsfield right now, and there isn't really a huge frames per second difference. It is still sticking at around the same place, and we're still getting around the same CPU and GPU usage that we were getting before. Now when we come outside, we have an increase in frames per second in addition to an increase in GPU and CPU usage, and everything still looks really great. So as expected, around this area, which is a lot less populated, we do not have a significant frames per second loss. That's all for this video, showing off the performance for a more mid-range PC in FS 2020. If you guys have any questions, please leave them down below, and I will try to answer as many of them as I can in order to make sure that you guys understand what the experience is like as best you can before the simulator releases on the 18th. Thank you guys so much for watching. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and if you like this video, please be sure to give it a like. We'll see you guys in the next video.